Philosophical background. The composition of the Meditations is normally dated to the 170s, Marcus's last decade. That this was a dark and stressful period for him can hardly be doubted. In the 10 years between 169 and 179, he had to cope with constant fighting on the frontier, the abortive revolt of Cassius, and the deaths of his colleague, Verus, his wife, Faustina, and others. Though he could hardly have anticipated the century of turmoil that would follow his death, he may have suspected that his son and successor, Commodus, was not the man he hoped. That in these circumstances Marcus should have sought consolation in philosophy is only natural. But understanding what Marcus looked for from his philosophical studies requires a certain amount of orientation. To understand the Meditations in context, we must familiarize ourselves not only with Stoicism, the philosophical system that underlies the work, but also with the role of philosophy in ancient life more generally. Today, philosophy is an academic discipline, one that few people other than professional philosophers would consider central to their everyday existence. While we may think of ourselves as having a philosophy of life, it bears little relation to what goes on in the philosophy departments of our universities. The careers of 20th century analytic philosophy often seem remote from what the American philosopher Thomas Nagel terms mortal questions. The problems involved in making ethical choices, constructing a just society, responding to suffering and loss, and coming to terms with the prospect of death. Indeed, most of us would be inclined to see these issues as the province of religion rather than philosophy. For Marcus and his contemporaries, the situation was very different. Ancient philosophy certainly had its academic side. Athens and other large cities had publicly financed chairs of philosophy, and professional philosophers taught, argued, and wrote as they do today. But philosophy also had a more practical dimension. It was not merely a subject to write or argue about, but one that was expected to provide a design for living, a set of rules to live one's life by. This was a need not met by ancient religion, which privileged ritual over doctrine and provided little in the way of moral and ethical guidelines. Nor did anyone expect it to. That was what philosophy was for. Philosophy, in the modern sense, is largely the creation of one man, the 5th century BC Athenian thinker Socrates. But it is primarily in the Hellenistic period that we see the rise of philosophical sects, promulgating coherent belief systems that an individual could accept as a whole and which were designed to explain the world in its totality. Of these Hellenistic systems, the most important, both for Romans in general and for Marcus in particular, was the Stoic school. The movement takes its name from the stoa, porch or portico, in downtown Athens, where its founder Zeno, 332/262 BC, taught and lectured. Zeno's doctrines were reformulated and developed by his successors, Cleanthes, 331-232 BC, and Chrysippus, 280-206 BC. Chrysippus, in particular, was a voluminous writer, and it was he who laid the foundations for systematic Stoicism. This early academic Stoicism is the source of certain key terms and concepts that reappear frequently in the Meditations, and proper understanding of Marcus's approach requires some familiarity with the system as a whole. Stoicism. Of the doctrines central to the Stoic worldview, perhaps the most important is the unwavering conviction that the world is organized in a rational and coherent way. More specifically, it is controlled and directed by an all-pervading force that the Stoics designated by the term logos. The term, from which English logic and the suffix logi derive, has a semantic range so broad as to be almost untranslatable. At a basic level, it designates rational, connected thought, whether envisioned as a characteristic, rationality, the ability to reason, or as the product of that characteristic, an intelligible utterance or a connected discourse. Logos operates both in individuals and in the universe as a whole. In individuals, it is the faculty of reason. On a cosmic level, it is the rational principle that governs the organization of the universe. In this sense, it is synonymous with nature, providence, or God. When the author of John's Gospel tells us what the Word, Logos, was with God and is to be identified with God, he is borrowing Stoic terminology. All events are determined by the Logos and follow in an unbreakable chain of cause and effect. Stoicism is thus, from the outset, a deterministic system that appears to leave no room for human free will or moral responsibility. In reality, the Stoics were reluctant to accept such an arrangement and attempted to get around the difficulty by defining free will as a voluntary accommodation to what is in any case inevitable. According to this theory, man is like a dog tied to a moving wagon. If the dog refuses to run along with the wagon, he will be dragged by it, yet the choice remains his, to run or be dragged. In the same way, humans are responsible for their choices and actions, even though these have been anticipated by the Logos and form part of its plan. Even actions which appear to be, and indeed are, immoral or unjust advance the overall design, which takes as a whole is harmonious and good. They too are governed by the Logos. But the Logos is not simply an impersonal power that governs and directs the world. It is also an actual substance that pervades that world, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a form as concrete as oxygen or carbon. In its physical embodiment, the Logos exists as pneuma, a substance imagined by the earliest Stoics as pure fire, and by Chrysippus as a mixture of fire and air. Pneuma is the power, the vital breath, that animates animals and humans. It is, in Dilys Thomas's phrase, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, and is present even in lifeless materials like stone or metal as the energy that holds the object together, the internal tension that makes a stone a stone. All objects are thus a compound of lifeless substance and vital force. When Marcus refers, as he does on a number of occasions, to cause and material, he means the two elements of these compounds, inert substance and animating pneuma, which are united so long as the object itself exists. When the object perishes, the pneuma that animated it is reabsorbed into the Logos as a whole. The process of destruction and reintegration happens to individual objects at every moment. It also happens on a larger scale to the entire universe, which at vast intervals is entirely consumed by fire, a process known as ekpyrosis, and then regenerated. If the world is indeed orderly, if the Logos controls all things, then the order it produces should be discernible in all aspects of it. That supposition not only led the Stoics to speculate about the nature of the physical world, but also motivated them to seek the rationality characteristic of the Logos in other areas, notably in formal logic and the nature and structure of language. Their interest in etymology is reflected in several entries in the Meditations. This systematizing impulse reappears in many other fields as well. The catalogue of Chrysippus's own works, preserved by the late 3rd century biographer Diogenes Laertius, is very long indeed. It includes not only philosophical treatises in a narrow sense, but also works such as On How to Read Poetry and Against the Touching Up of Paintings. Later Stoics would try their hands at history and anthropology as well as more conventional philosophical topics. The expansion of Stoic thought was not only intellectual but also geographical. The movement had been born in Athens. In the century and a half that followed Chrysippus's death, it spread to other centers, in particular to Rome. The Romans of the 2nd century BC were in the midst of a course of conquest that by the end of the century would leave them the effective masters of the Mediterranean. With conquest came culture. Looking back on the rapid Hellenization of the Roman aristocracy between 200 BC and his own day, the poet Horace famously observed that conquered Greece was the true conqueror. Nowhere is the influence of Greece more obvious than in philosophy. Greek philosophers, including the Stoics, Panaetius, circa 185 to 109 BC, and Posidonius, circa 135 to 50 BC, visited Rome to lecture. Many spent extended periods there. In the 1st century BC, it became the fashion for young upper-class Romans to study in Athens, in an ancient version of the 18th century Grand Tour. Roman aristocrats acted as patrons to individual philosophers and assembled large libraries of philosophical texts, like that of the famous Via of the Papyri at Herculaneum, and Romans like Cicero and Lucretius attempted to expound Greek philosophical doctrines in Latin. On the major philosophical schools, it was Stoicism that had the greatest appeal. Unlike some other sects, the Stoics had always approved of participation in public life, and this stand struck a chord with the Roman aristocracy, whose code of values placed a premium on political and military activity. Stoicism has even been described, not altogether unfairly, as the real religion of upper-class Romans. In the process, it became a rather different version of the philosophy from that taught by Zeno and Chrysippus. Perhaps the most important development was a shift in emphasis, a narrowing of focus. Early and middle Stoicism was a holistic system. It aimed to embrace all knowledge, and its focus was speculative and theoretical. Roman Stoicism, by contrast, was a practical discipline, not an abstract system of thought, but an attitude to life. Partly for historical reasons, it is this Romanized Stoicism that has influenced later generations. Indeed, the application of the adjective Stoic to a person who shows strength and courage in misfortune probably owes more to the aristocratic Roman value system than it does to Greek philosophers. Stoicism, in its later form, was a system inspired as much by individuals as by texts or doctrines. One of its most distinguished adherents was Marcus Cato, known as Cato the Younger to distinguish him from his great-grandfather, prominent a century earlier. A senator of renowned rectitude, when Julius Caesar marched on Rome in 49 BC, Cato sided with Caesar's rival Pompey in defense of the legitimate government. When it was clear that Caesar would triumph, Cato chose not to survive the Republic, killing himself after the Battle of Munda in 46. Within a century, he had become an emblem of Stoic resistance to tyranny. Under Nero, he was immortalized by the poet Lucan and praised in a laudatory biography by the senator Thrasea, whose own resistance to Nero cost him his life. Thracia's son-in-law, Helvidius Priscus, played a similar role and came to a similar end under Vespasian. Thrasea and Helvidius, in their turn, served as role models to second-century aristocrats like Marcus's mentors, Rusticus, Maximus, and Severus. Marcus himself pays tribute to them and to Cato in Meditations 1.14. Cato, Thrasea, and Helvidius were doers, not writers, and their legendary heroism inevitably lends them a somewhat two-dimensional quality. A more complex and much more interesting figure was the poet Lucan's uncle, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, circa 4 BC to 65 AD, commonly known as Seneca the Younger to distinguish him from his equally distinguished father. Originally counselor to the young Nero, he was eventually forced to commit suicide after being implicated in an attempted coup against the erstwhile pupil. Men's lives are not always consistent with their ideals, and some critics have found it hard to reconcile Seneca's fabulous wealth and his shameless flattery of Nero with his philosophical views. Yet his works, in particular the letters to Lucilius, remain the most engaging and accessible expressions of later Stoicism. Because they were written in Latin, they were also among the most influential on succeeding generations. But not all Stoics were wealthy senators. There was another kind of Stoic exemplar as well, the outsider whose ascetic lifestyle won him the admiration of his wealthier contemporaries and enabled him to criticize the pretenses of upper-class society with real authority. An early example of the type is Gaius Musonius Rufus, circa 30 to 100, a member of the Roman administrative class, the so-called Knights, Equites, who was banished by both Nero and Vespasian. A still more dramatic example was Musonius's students Epictetus, circa 55 through 135, who had taken up the practice of philosophy as a slave and devoted the remainder of his life to it after being freed. He had been exiled to Nicopolis in northern Greece under Domitian, and after the tyrant's death, elected to remain there, where he taught and lectured to visitors who often traveled great distances to study with him. One of these was the upper-class historian and statesman Arrian, circa 86 to 160, who published an extensive record of the master's discussions, a text conventionally referred to as the Discourses of Epictetus. He later produced an abridged version, the Enchiriadon, manual or handbook. Epictetus seems to have been an especially important figure for Marcus. He thanks his philosophical mentor Rusticus for introducing him to Epictetus's lectures, either the discourses themselves or a private set of lecture notes. And a series of quotations and paraphrases from the philosopher appear in Book 11 of the Meditations. And Arrian's abridged Enchiridion provides the closest literary parallel to the Meditations itself, not only in its content, but also in its form, a series of relatively short and unrelated entries. Stoicism and the Meditations. The late Stoicism of Epictetus is a radically stripped-down version of its Hellenistic predecessor, a philosophy which had learned much from its competitors and had almost forgotten parts of itself. Both these tendencies, the narrowing of the field and the eclectic borrowing from non-Stoic sources, can be discerned also in the Meditations. Chrysippus and his followers had divided knowledge into three areas: logic, physics, and ethics, concerned, respectively, with the nature of knowledge, the structure of the physical world, and the proper role of human beings in that world. Marcus pays lip service to this triadic division in at least one entry, 8.13, but it is clear from other chapters and from the Meditations as a whole that logic and physics were not his focus. Among the things for which he thanks the gods is that he was never absorbed by logic chopping or preoccupied by physics, 1.17. Occasional entries show an awareness of Stoic thought about language. The etymological pun in 8.57 is perhaps the clearest example. But they are the exception, not the rule. In many cases, Marcus's logic is weak, the logic of the rhetorician, not of the philosopher. It is rare to find a developed chain of reasoning like that in Meditations 4.4. His interest is in the nature of the physical world is limited to its relevance to human problems. About one of the basic Stoic physical doctrines, the notion of the periodic conflagration, ekpyrosis, that ends a cosmic cycle, Marcus adopts an agnostic position, though he was not alone in this. To him it was ethics that was the basis of the system. Just because you've abandoned your hopes of becoming a great thinker or scientist, don't give up on attaining freedom, achieving humility, serving others. 7.67. The questions that the Meditations tries to answer are primarily metaphysical and ethical ones. Why are we here? How should we live our lives? How can we ensure that we do what is right? How can we protect ourselves against the stresses and pressures of daily life? How should we deal with pain and misfortune? How can we live with the knowledge that someday we will no longer exist? It would be both pointless and impertinent to try to summarize Marcus's responses. The influence of the Meditations on later readers springs in part from the clarity and insistence with which he addresses these questions. It may be worthwhile, however, to draw attention to one pattern of thought that is central to the philosophy of the Meditations, as well as to Epictetus, and that has been identified and documented in detail by Pierre Hadot. This is the doctrine of the three disciplines, the disciplines of perception, of action, and of the will. The discipline of perception requires that we maintain absolute objectivity of thought, that we see things dispassionately for what they are. Proper understanding of this point requires a brief introduction to the Stoic theory of cognition. We have seen that for the Stoics, universal order is represented by the logos. The logos infuses and is wielded by our hegemonikon, literally, that which guides, which is the intellective part of our consciousness. In different contexts, it can approximate either will or character, and it performs many of the functions that English speakers attribute to the brain or the heart. One of its primary functions is to process and assess the data we receive from our senses. At every instant, the objects and events in the world around us bombard us with impressions. As they do so, they produce a fantasia, a mental impression. From this, the mind generates a perception, hypolepsis, which might best be compared to a print made from a photographic negative. Ideally, this print will be an accurate and faithful representation of the original, but it may not be. It may be blurred, or it may include shadow images that distort or obscure the original. Chief among these are inappropriate value judgments, the designation as good or evil of things that in fact are neither good nor evil. For example, my impression that my house has just burned down is simply that, an impression or report conveyed to me by my senses about an event in the outside world. By contrast, my perception that my house has burned down and I have thereby suffered a terrible tragedy includes not only an impression but also an interpretation imposed upon that initial impression by my powers of hypolepsis. It is by no means the only possible interpretation, and I am not obliged to accept it. I may be a good deal better off if I decline to do so. It is, in other words, not objects and events, but the interpretations we place on them that are the problem. Our duty is therefore to exercise stringent control over the faculty of perception, with the aim of protecting our mind from error. The second discipline, that of action, relates to our relationship with other people. Human beings, for Marcus, as for the Stoics generally, are social animals, a point he makes often, e.g. 5.16, 8.59, 9.1. All human beings possess not only a share of the logos, but also the ability to use it. That is what makes us human and distinguishes us from other animals. But it would perhaps be more accurate to say that we are participants in the logos, which is as much a process as a substance. Marcus himself, more than once, compares the world ruled by logos to a city in which all human beings are citizens, with all the duties inherent in citizenship. As human beings, we are a part of nature, and our duty is to accommodate ourselves to its demands and requirements, to live as nature requires, as Marcus often puts it. To do this, we must make proper use of the logos we have been allotted and perform as best we can the functions assigned us in the master plan of the larger, cosmic logos, of which it is a part. This requires not merely passive acquiescence in what happens, but active cooperation with the world, with fate, and, above all, with other human beings. We were made, Marcus tells us over and over, not for ourselves but for others, and our nature is fundamentally unselfish. In our relationships with others, we must work for their collective good while treating them justly and fairly as individuals. Marcus never defines what he means by justice, and is it important to recognize what the term implies and what it does not. All human beings have a share of the logos, and all have roles to play in the vast design that is the world. But this is not to say that all humans are equal, or that the roles they are assigned are interchangeable. Marcus, like most of his contemporaries, took it for granted that human society was hierarchical, and this is borne out by the images he uses to describe it. Human society is a single organism, like an individual human body or a tree, but the trunk of the tree is not to be confused with the leaves or the hands and feet with the head. Our duty to act justly does not mean that we must treat others as our equals. It means that we must treat them as they deserve. And their deserts are determined in part by their position in the hierarchy. Stoicism's emphasis on the orderliness of the universe implies a similar orderliness and harmony in its parts, and part of its appeal to upper-class Romans may have been that it did not force its adherents to ask difficult questions about the organization of the society that they lived in. The third discipline, the discipline of will, is in a sense the counterpart to the second, the discipline of action. The latter governs our approach to the things in our control, those that we do. The discipline of will governs our attitude to things that are not within our control, those that we have done to us by others or by nature. We control our own actions and are responsible for them. If we act wrongly, then we have done serious harm to ourselves, though not, it should be emphasized, to others or to the Logos. By contrast, things outside our control have no ability to harm us. Acts of wrongdoing by a human agent, torture, theft, or other crimes, harm the agent, not the victim. Acts of nature, such as fire, illness, or death, can harm us only if we choose to see them as harmful. When we do so, we question the benevolence and providence of the Logos and thereby degrade our own Logos. This, of course, we must not do. Instead, we must see things for what they are. Here, the discipline of perception is relevant, and accept them by exercising the discipline of will, or what Epictetus calls, in a phrase quoted by Marcus, the art of acquiescence. For if we recognize that all events have been foreseen by the Logos and form part of its plan, and that the plan in question is unfailingly good, as it must be, then it follows that we must accept whatever fate has in store for us, however unpleasant it may appear, trusting that, in Alexander Pope's phrase, whatever is right. This applies to all obstacles and apparent misfortunes, and in particular to death, a process that we cannot prevent, which therefore does not harm us, and which accordingly we must accept willingly as natural and proper. Together, the three disciplines constitute a comprehensive approach to life, and in various combinations and reformulations, they underlie a large number of the entries in the Meditations. We see them laid out starkly and implicitly in Meditations 7.54. Everywhere, at each moment, you have the option to accept this event with humility, will, to treat this person as he should be treated, action, to approach this thought with care so that nothing irrational creeps in, perception. We find the same triad rephrased and reordered in Meditations 9.6, objective judgment, unselfish action, willing acceptance of all external events. And we find it in a more subtle form underlying Meditations 8.7. Progress for a rational mind means not accepting falsehood or uncertainty in its perceptions, making unselfish actions its only aim, seeking and shunning only the things it has control over, embracing what nature demands of it, the nature in which it participates, as the leaf's nature does in the trees. A score of other entries could be cited. The almost obsessive repetition of these 3 points suggests that they lie at the very heart of Marcus's thought and of his project in the Meditations. Other influences. Marcus Aurelius is often thought of and referred to as the quintessential Stoic, yet the only explicit reference to Stoicism in the Meditations, 5.1, is phrased in curiously distant terms, as if it were merely one school among others. The great figures of early Stoicism are conspicuous by their absence. Neither Zeno nor Cleanthes is mentioned in the Meditations, and Chrysippus appears only twice, quoted once in passing for a pithy comparison, 6.42, and included with Socrates and Epictetus in a list of dead thinkers, 7.19. This is not to deny the essentially Stoic basis of Marcus's thought, or the deep influence on him exercised by later Stoic thinkers, most obviously Epictetus. If he had to be identified with a particular school, that is surely the one he would have chosen. Yet I suspect that if asked what it was that he studied, his answer would have been not Stoicism, but simply philosophy. There is nothing surprising about this. The imperial period saw the development of a widespread ecumenical tendency in philosophy. Adherents of most of the major schools, the Platonists, Peripatetics, Cynics, and Stoics, preferred to focus on the points they shared rather than those that separated them. Not all the figures Marcus credits as influential on his own philosophical development were Stoics. Severus, for example, was a Peripatetic. Although authors like Seneca and Epictetus accepted the basic premises of the system developed by Zeno and Chrysippus, they showed no reluctance to borrow aphorisms, anecdotes, and argumentative strategies from the non-Stoic sources. The Meditations follows a similar procedure. While built on a Stoic foundation, it also refers to and quotes a wide range of figures, both precursors of the Stoics and representatives of rival schools. Of the predecessors Marcus invokes, the most important is surely Socrates, the great Athenian thinker who had helped redirect philosophy from a preoccupation with the physical world to a focus on the role of man in society and the nature of human morality. Socrates himself wrote nothing. His teachings were transmitted, and greatly elaborated, in the philosophical dialogues of his student Plato. Marcus quotes Plato repeatedly, especially in Book 7, and Socratic or Platonic elements can be discerned elsewhere too. One example is the so-called Socratic paradox, the claim that no one does wrong willfully, and that if men were able to recognize what is right, they would inevitably do it. They are like this, Marcus says of other people, because they can't tell good from evil, 2.1, and he repeats this assertion elsewhere. Socrates' character was as important as his doctrines. His legendary endurance and self-denial made him an ideal model for the Stoic philosopher, or any philosopher. His refusal to compromise his philosophical beliefs led him to make the ultimate sacrifice when he was put on trial at the age of 70 and trumped up charges of impiety. His display of integrity at the trial and his comportment in the days leading up to his execution made it easy to view him as a forerunner of first-century Stoic martyrs like Thrasea Paetius or Helvidius Priscus, and it is in this light that Marcus evokes him in Meditation 7.66. Of Socrates' predecessors, the so-called pre-Socratic thinkers, the most important, both for Marcus and the Stoics generally, was Heraclitus, the mysterious figure from Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, whose Zen-like aphorisms were proverbial from their profundity and obscurity alike. Heraclitus's philosophical system ascribed a central role to logos and to fire as the primordial element. Both elements were naturally congenial to the Stoics and may well have influenced them. Heraclitus is mentioned in a handful of entries in the Meditations, 4.46, 6.47, but his doctrines can be traced in many others. Moreover, his concision and epigrammatic phrasing anticipate the kind of enigmatic apothegm we find in a number of entries. The best revenge is not to be like that, 6.6. Straight, not straight-end, 7.12. The fencer's weapon is picked up and put down again. The boxer's is part of him, 12.9. It is from Heraclitus that Marcus derives one of his most memorable motifs, that of the unstable flux of time and matter in which we move. We cannot step twice into the same river, Heraclitus had said, and we see Marcus expanding on the observation. Time is a river, a violent current of events, glimpsed once and already carried past us, and another follows and is gone, 4.43, and compare 2.17, 6.15. Though Heraclitus was clearly the pre-Socratic who most influenced Marcus, other thinkers leave traces as well. Marcus twice borrows the poet Empedocles' image of the self-contained soul as a perfect sphere, 8.41, 12.3, and he alludes once to the mystic doctrines of the Pythagoreans, 11.27. Several entries explore the implications of phrases attributed to Democritus, one of the inventors of the theory of atoms, which would later inspire the Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus. Neither Heraclitus nor Socrates had founded a school. That was an achievement reserved for Plato, and then for Plato's student Aristotle, who broke from his master to found the Peripatetic movement. Marcus never refers to Aristotle, though he does quote approvingly from the latter's successor Theophrastus, 2.10. Probably more important was another 4th century BC movement, Cynicism. The Cynics, of whom the first and most notorious was the irascible Diogenes of Sinope, were united less by doctrine than by a common attitude, namely their contempt for societal institutions and a desire for a life more in accord with nature. Diogenes himself was largely responsible for the image of a philosopher as an impoverished ascetic, the philosopher without clothes, evoked by Marcus at Meditations 4.3, might well be a cynic. His famous claim to be a citizen of the world surely anticipates, if it did not actually influence, the Stoic conception of the world as a city-state. Marcus refers to Diogenes in several passages as well as to the latter student Monomus, 2.15, and invokes another cynic, Crates, at Meditation 6.13, in an anecdote whose tenor is now uncertain. Marcus's relationship to Epicureanism, Stoicism's great rival among Hellenistic philosophical systems, is much more vexed. The followers of Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, believed in a universe radically unlike that posited by Zeno and Chrysippus. The Stoic world is ordered to the nth degree. The Epicurean universe is random, the product of the haphazard conjunctions of billions of atoms. To speak of providence in such a world is transparently absurd, and while Epicurus acknowledged the existence of gods, he denied that they took any interest in human life. As for humans, our role is simply to live as best we can, making the most of what pleasures are available to us and insulating ourselves as far as possible from pain and anxiety. In particular, we are to feel no anxiety about death, which consists simply in the dissolution of our component atoms. This process is not only inevitable, but harmless for the simple reason that after death there is no us to suffer harm. Although the sect numbered not a few prominent Romans among its adherents, it never attained the success of Stoicism and was regarded with genial contempt by most outsiders. The quietism endorsed by the Epicureans was obviously difficult to reconcile with an active public life, an important Roman value, and the Epicurean equation of the good with pleasure was bound to raise eyebrows among conservative Romans. Eat, drink, and be merry was popularly supposed to be the Epicureans' motto, though Epicurus himself had been quite explicit in identifying pleasure with intellectual contemplation rather than the vulgar enjoyment of food and sex. Though a minority view, Epicureanism was, nonetheless, the only potential rival to Stoicism in offering a systematic cosmology, as Marcus acknowledges on a number of occasions by the stark dichotomy, providence or atoms, 4.3, 10.6, 11.18, 12.14. Marcus normally seems to view Epicureanism with disapproval, as we would expect. In Meditation 6.1, he contrasts the Epicurean universe, founded on mixture, interaction, dispersal, with the components of the Stoic system, unity, order, design, clearly to the advantage of the latter. Should we not be ashamed to fear death, he asks in another entry, when even the Epicureans disdain it, 12.34. But other entries suggest a less dismissive attitude. Marcus quotes with apparent approval Epicurus' account of his own exemplary conduct during an illness, 9.41, and twice seeks comfort in the philosopher's remarks on the endurance of pain, 7.33, 7.64. Like other late Stoics, Seneca is a notable example, he was willing to accept truth wherever he found it. Thus far, we have been concerned with the content of the Meditations, the ethical doctrine of late Stoicism, incorporating a certain amount of Platonic and Heraclitean material and overlaid with occasional reference to other schools and thinkers. But what of the Meditations itself? How and why was it written? Who is its audience? What kind of book is it? For the answers to these questions, we must turn from the book's content to its form and origins.